The Strait of Hormuz is one of the few places on Earth where a single sentence can move the global economy. And today's sentence, reported in Al Jazeera's live coverage, is this. Tehran says the Hormuz Strait has been shut down again, blaming U.S. piracy. The most important word there isn't shut down, it's again. Because again tells you this isn't a one-off scare. It's a repeating pressure tactic, an on-off switch being used as leverage. When a government says it has shut down a choke point like Hormuz, you have to read it on two levels at once. Level 1 is literal. Are ships actually unable to transit, or being turned back, or being warned away? Level 2 is strategic. Who is the message for, and what behavior is it trying to change right now? Because even the claim of closure can do damage if it's credible enough to change routing, insurance, and prices. And then there's the phrase Tehran is using, piracy. That is not an accidental word choice. Piracy is a narrative weapon. It's meant to do three things simultaneously. Delegitimize U.S. actions, justify retaliation or restrictions as self-defense, and pull neutral countries toward Iran's framing by appealing to an idea that resonates globally, unlawful seizure and lawlessness at sea. This is how the modern escalation ladder works, not with a declaration of war, not with an official blockade proclamation, but with competing legal narratives over who has the right to stop what, inspect what, seize what, and control what, while commercial shipping tries to survive the uncertainty. Here's what you need to understand immediately. Hormuz doesn't need to be fully closed to function like it's closing. It only needs to become risky enough that ship owners, insurers, and governments start acting like the danger is real. In a choke point, perception becomes policy faster than policy becomes reality. And once the private sector begins to price in risk, reversing that psychology can take longer than reopening the waterway. So in this briefing, I'm going to break down what piracy is signaling, what a shutdown can mean in practical terms without a formal blockade, why the again matters more than the headline shock, and what happens next. Because the next phase isn't determined by a press quote. It's determined by behavior, shipping traffic, insurance language, naval posture, and whether anyone introduces a mechanism to prevent the sea from becoming the main battlefield. Let's clarify what a shutdown looks like in the real world. Because there are multiple ways to close a strait without putting a literal gate across it. There's legal closure, official declarations, formal restrictions, announced exclusions. There's operational closure, threats and actions that make transit unsafe or unpredictable. And there's commercial closure. The moment insurers won't cover voyages at a viable price, captains won't sail, and companies reroute because the risk to reward math breaks. Most choke points don't collapse from one dramatic announcement. They tighten through friction. A warning becomes an advisory becomes a reroute becomes a backlog becomes market panic. That's why the details matter less than the pattern. If shutdown again becomes the new normal headline cycle, the world starts treating Hormuz like a switch that can be flipped whenever the politics demand it. Now let's deal with the piracy claim, because this is where the narrative becomes a tool of escalation management. When Tehran labels U.S. actions as piracy, it's trying to redefine the operating environment at sea. It's telling ship owners and foreign governments, this isn't law enforcement, this is predation. And that framing is designed to create political space for Iran to justify actions that would otherwise be seen as aggressive, like restricting transit, increasing inspections, or enabling harassment through aligned forces, while presenting it as a response to an unlawful act. It also puts pressure on third parties. Countries that want to stay neutral don't want to be caught on the wrong side of piracy. Shipping nations, energy importers, and trade-dependent economies tend to react strongly to any suggestion that the sea is becoming lawless. Tehran knows that. So piracy isn't just an accusation aimed at Washington. It's a signal aimed at everyone whose economy depends on predictable transit. And there's a second reason the word matters. It invites a counter-story from the U.S. side. If Washington frames its actions as lawful interdiction, sanctions enforcement, or protection of navigation, and Iran frames them as piracy, you're not just watching a naval standoff. You're watching a legitimacy contest. In a legitimacy contest, each side becomes more likely to take actions that demonstrate control rather than actions that de-escalate quietly. Because control is the currency of credibility in these moments. Now connect this to the strategic role of Hormuz itself. The Strait of Hormuz is a compression point for global energy flows and commercial shipping. Widely cited estimates often place roughly 1/5 of globally traded oil transiting that route in normal conditions, along with significant LNG movements. That doesn't mean every disruption becomes a total shock. It means the system is sensitive. Even partial disruption, or even the credible threat of disruption, can raise a global risk premium fast. And that risk premium doesn't stay in the Gulf. It travels. It shows up as higher fuel costs, higher freight rates, higher insurance premiums, delayed shipments, supply chain stress, and political pressure in capitals that are not parties. to the conflict, but are forced to pay for it. That's why the strait is not just geography, it's leverage. So when Tehran says shut down again, you should think less about the water and more about the strategy. This is pressure applied not only to the U.S., but to the global stakeholders who can influence the U.S. through diplomacy, through economic pressure, through calls for restraint, or through demands for stability that translate into concessions. Now let's get to the question everyone really cares about. What happens next? Because in chokepoint crises, the next move usually follows one of three paths. And you can often see which path is coming by watching a few key signals. Path 1, a short disruption followed by a managed reopening. In this scenario, shutdown again is a high-volume signal designed to force attention and negotiations, but not to trigger uncontrollable escalation. Shipping slows, some vessels pause, insurance spikes briefly, and then the waterway is functionally reopened under heavy monitoring. This path often comes with intensified rhetoric, followed by quietly lowered temperatures. Channels are open, technical talks, deconfliction, restraint. The goal here isn't peace. The goal is leverage without losing control. This is the path you get when both sides fear the economic consequences of a sustained closure more than they fear the optics of backing off. Path 2, a partial closure that behaves like a slow choke. This is the more dangerous path because it looks manageable day to day while steadily increasing the chance of a catalytic incident. The strait is technically open, but commercially it tightens. Heightened advisories, more inspections, intermittent disruptions, harassment claims, increased escort activity, and an environment where every transit is a calculated risk. This is where the phrase piracy becomes operationally useful. Because once you declare the other side is acting like pirates, you can justify a wide range of defensive maritime behavior without admitting you're imposing an economic weapon. It's plausible deniability in narrative form. And this is also where miscalculation becomes more likely, because you get constant contact without clear rules. In constant contact, it's not the planned operation that starts the war. It's the accident. Someone gets spooked, a maneuver is misread, warning shots become real shots, a drone is misidentified, an incident spirals, and suddenly leaders are responding to events rather than managing them. Path 3, escalation through the choke point as the main pressure lever. This is the snap risk path. Here, shutdown again is not just a headline. It becomes the staging ground for broader coercion, whether through aggressive interdictions, mining fears, missile drone threat signaling, or actions by aligned forces that expand uncertainty. Full closure is rare and extremely risky, but you don't need full closure to trigger global shock. In a choke point, partial disruption can be enough to send prices and premiums sharply upward. Now here's the critical point. The transition moment is the most dangerous moment. The moment the strait is declared shut, the moment it is declared reopened, the moment one side claims piracy, the moment the other side rejects it, those are the moments where rules are fuzzy and pride is high. And fuzzy rules plus high pride equals a higher probability of a misstep. So what would stabilization look like if anyone is trying to prevent the sea from becoming the battlefield? It would look like mechanisms, not promises. Hotlines, deconfliction procedures, explicit guidance to maritime forces, third-party messaging that establishes boundaries, and ideally, some visible reduction in the behaviors that create ambiguity, like shadowing high-speed approaches or ambiguous inspections. Because without mechanisms, the strait becomes a stress test, not of navies, but of decision-making under uncertainty. And decision-making under uncertainty is where wars expand. This is also where the money layer hits fast. Markets don't wait for confirmation of physical closure. They price risk on probability. If the world believes Hormuz can be shut down again whenever the political temperature rises, then the market's baseline risk premium rises, even on days the strait is technically open. That can turn a temporary crisis into a sustained drag. So what happens next isn't one event. It's a branching set of pressures. Commercial behavior, diplomatic pressure from importers, military posturing, and narrative warfare over legality. And the piracy claim is designed to win that narrative war, because whoever wins the narrative often wins the coalition's space to act. Here's what to watch over the next 24 to 72 hours. If you want to know whether this is heading towards stabilization, slow choke, or snap escalation. Because in choke point crises, the tells appear before the official outcomes. First, watch shipping behavior. Are vessels transiting normally, or are they bunching up outside the corridor? Are there visible holding patterns? Do ships appear to be delaying passage, favoring daylight, or clustering near perceived safe zones? Commercial actors don't take political sides. They take risk positions. Their behavior is the earliest indicator of what shutdown means in practice. Second, watch insurance and maritime advisory language. This is where perception becomes policy. If the tone shifts from elevated caution to avoid transit recommendations, the strait is effectively tightening regardless of official statements. If premiums spike and stay elevated, the market is telling you the risk is not viewed as temporary. Third, watch naval posture and escort signaling. If escort language becomes more prominent, if you see more talk of security corridors, convoying, or expanded patrol messaging, that can be stabilizing or escalatory depending on what it's paired with. Stabilizing posture is paired with deconfliction messaging. Escalatory posture is paired with absolutist rhetoric and threats. Fourth, watch diplomatic intermediaries. When stabilization is coming, intermediaries start sounding procedural. Channels, technical discussions, frameworks so they don't avoid misunderstandings. When escalation is coming, language hardens. Red lines. Will respond. No compromise. Illegitimate. Fifth, and this matters more than people admit, watch how the piracy claim is answered. If the U.S. response emphasizes legality, international norms, and coalition messaging, that indicates a legitimacy contest is being fought publicly. If the response is vague, it may indicate back channels are active and both sides want room to maneuver. The tone of that exchange tells you whether the next phase is diplomacy under pressure or pressure replacing diplomacy. Now, let me tie this together with the core reality of Hormuz. The strait is not just a route, it's a global confidence test. When Tehran says it has shut it down again and frames U.S. actions as piracy, it is telling the world that navigation is conditional, and that condition is political. That is precisely the kind of message that forces everyone else to get involved, because everyone else pays the bill. And that's why the question, what happens next, isn't just about whether ships move today. It's about whether the world is entering a period where Hormuz is treated like a repeating lever, open when convenient, threatened when useful, shut down again when pressure is needed. If this becomes the pattern, then even temporary reopenings won't restore normalcy quickly, because normalcy is trust, and trust collapses faster than it rebuilds. So the next phase of this story will be determined by one thing. Does anyone install a pressure valve before the system overheats again? A real valve looks like deconfliction and rules that reduce accidents. A fake valve looks like announcements without mechanisms, while risk remains high and contact remains constant. Because once a choke point becomes a bargaining chip, the ocean stops being geography. It becomes strategy. And when the sea becomes strategy, the consequences don't stay at sea. They show up in prices and politics and in the speed at which a live war becomes a wider one.